Welcome to the Better Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm Ciaran O'Connor.
I'm John Wood Jr.
It's Friday, March 22nd. We're coming at you live from the network studios in sunny Culver City, California. Happy Friday, John.
Happy Friday, Ciaran.
It's good to be back. Really excited to get back in the saddle this week. We've got a very interesting guest whom I'm very excited to introduce and talk to. Today we have Terry Szuplat. Terry was a speechwriter for Barack Obama for all 8 years, one of the longest-serving speechwriters. He focused on foreign policy. He wrote on global security, international economics, entrepreneurship, development, human rights. He was a special assistant to the president, and in the second term served as the deputy director of the White House speechwriting office. He also accompanied President Obama on trips to 40 foreign countries. Terry, welcome to the podcast. We are very appreciative of you coming on.
Well, thanks for asking me. It's great to be here.
Yes. So, Terry, I guess first, obviously you've had some fascinating experience. I'd love to just hear a little bit about your background, how you got into politics, how you came to work for President Obama, what it was like working in the White House, and then sort of how you've evolved since the 2016 election, how you got interested in Better Angels and coming to talk with us today. So I know that's a lot, but, love
Sure.
to hear just kind of a brief rundown.
Sure. First thing you asked was how I got involved in politics. Listen, I grew up in Massachusetts. I was always interested in government and politics and rhetoric. And when I was in college, I had the opportunity to have an internship at the White House under President Clinton. And I was assigned randomly to the speechwriter's office, where I was a senior in college, and I was able to help draft remarks, do some research for President Clinton's national security speechwriters. And, I just, it bit me there. I thought that was the greatest job in the world, the opportunity to help shape how President of the United States communicates America's values, how the president, tells America's story to the world. And that's something I really decided then and there I wanted to do. And my first speechwriting job, I think I was about 23 years old. I got a speechwriting job as a speechwriter to the Secretary of Defense, who at the time was, and you'll find this interesting, I think your listeners will find this interesting, former Republican Senator from Maine, William Cohen, who left the Senate to work in the administration of Democrat Bill Clinton. So my first speechwriting job was directly for a Republican working in a Democratic administration, which was a really educational experience for me, and part of the process where I was able to advance causes I cared about, but also doing it in the context of writing for someone who came at a lot of the issues from a very different perspective than I did. That was my first speechwriting experience. That was in the late 90s, and eventually I found my way to President Obama's speechwriting team. The speechwriting world is a pretty small world. We all know each other, and I wasn't on the Obama campaign in 2008, but I did get to know some of them. And when the time came to build out their team, I was able to join, and I started in early 2009. Was there, as you said, for pretty much the whole 8 years.
And how'd you come to focus on foreign policy specifically?
Well, I think that's just my interest area. Again, having gotten my start as a speechwriter for the Secretary of Defense, that tended to be where, the longer I did it, the more I knew about that space. I loved being able to help a Secretary of Defense, a president, communicate to the rest of the world what we value as a country, what our interests are, how we want to advance them with other countries. And every speech as speechwriters, we often talk about our job as being translators. We're helping to translate complicated, complex public policy issues to the American people. And when you're writing for foreign audiences, you also have an added layer of challenge, which is to help translate our policies and programs and who we are as a people and what we value to people from profoundly different cultures than ours, and to try to find that common space. So whether you're speaking to an audience in Africa or Asia or Europe or South America, our values don't change, our interests don't change, what we champion as a country doesn't change, obviously, from region to region, but maybe how you speak to and how you communicate with and try to find some common ground with people from a, dramatically different life experience than you do is something I always enjoyed.
And to give our listeners a little bit of insight into what the speechwriting process looks like within a presidential administration, is it the case that there are different speechwriters that have very sort of individual ownership of the different areas of concern, like foreign policy or domestic policy or whatnot? Or is there a way in which you might sort of lead in a certain area, but there's kind of a collaborative review process between yourself and the other speechwriters? In other words, did you have a little bit of a window into the speechwriting on the domestic side, and
Right.
and did Favreau have a window into the foreign policy side, so on and so forth?
Sure. So, I can certainly speak to the Obama White House, the Obama speechwriting team. I think it's very similar to what other presidents have done. The speechwriting teams aren't that big. I mean, maybe in our case, we had 5, maybe 6 at a given time. And, I was assigned in the first term to focus primarily on foreign policy. I work closely with Ben Rhodes, the president's national security advisor for communications and strategy. That said, yeah, absolutely. Jon Favreau would sometimes jump on and take a foreign policy speech. The rest of us would sometimes jump on and do a domestic speech. In the second term, we kind of fused the sides of the house a little bit more. And as Ciaran was saying, I took on the role of deputy director of speechwriting in the second term. And so I continued to do mostly foreign policy, mostly national security, but also a number of as an editor on the domestic side. And again, you also, the president's voice, any president's voice, their policies, their value system, their worldview doesn't change dramatically when they speak to a domestic audience or an international audience. So we're just sort of two sides of the same coin. And we're often, to your question, we're often collaborating and working together and sharing drafts and, helping make each other's drafts better.
Right. Yeah, that all makes sense. Well, I definitely have some specific questions about, what your 8 years were like. But first, I just wonder, in terms of more recent history after the 2016 election, after leaving the administration, sort of how you got interested in Better Angels. And I know you attended a Better Angels workshop last year. So I'd love to just hear quickly about what'd you think of it.
Sure. It was pretty amazing. Listen, your first question is how I got involved and why I got involved. And I think the answer there is, like a lot of Americans, I've been really disturbed for many years about the level of, not partisanship. That's normal and that's necessary in a democracy, but the hyperpartisanship, the hyperpolarization, in Washington, but even in the country as well, among citizens. That's been going on. It didn't start with Trump, didn't start with Obama, didn't start with, anybody else. It's been going on for decades. There's, huge forces and trends at work, political, economic forces, social forces. But yeah, obviously, listen, I'm a Democrat, I'm a liberal, I'm a progressive, and I was deeply, deeply disturbed by the way that candidate Trump and then President Trump has conducted himself, his campaign, his tone, his rhetoric. The demonization of different groups. I think that, like there are a lot of Republicans who are deeply disturbed by that. And, sort of stepping back, obviously, again, as a Democrat, as a progressive, my primary goal politically is to help unseat him. But, again, this didn't start with him. And when he goes away, it's not going to, all of this hyperpartisanship is not going to go away either.
Right.
So I think we have to just, as citizens, understand how we got here, understand the larger forces at work, understand how we all, on some level, contribute to this in terms of how we talk, how we think, how we engage with each other as citizens who have different views. And that's sort of that's one of the things that led me to Better Angels and the workshop.
And so you watched the workshop. You watched a Red-Blue workshop, which obviously brings together a handful of liberals and conservatives for a day of structured discussions that are specifically designed, as you said, to help folks understand the other side's perspective, obviously in a world in which people are often just surrounded by people who agree with them, and to make their own ideology heard to the other side, but to do it in a way where they're not necessarily just attacking one another or even trying to convince each other that they're right. And so it's sort of an interesting balance, obviously, between being open and empathetic to the other side without compromising your values or papering over disagreements in an effort to just meet in the middle. So I just wonder, what was your response to the workshop? Do you think it was effective? And did it inspire you that the sort of work we're doing can actually make a real difference in our civic culture?
Right. There were sort of two. First of all, it was amazing. Like you said, I wasn't a participant. I wasn't there to. I was an observer, literally against the wall, watching this all unfold, and able to watch some of the small breakout sessions. And my two big takeaways were, "Wow, this is really hard." There were
definitely
moments when folks on both sides were asked to, convey their views, express their opinions without, demeaning the other side, without putting their side on. And boy, it was just really hard for some folks. You could see it. They would just tighten up. They would freeze. They would. You could see that they wanted to say something, probably what they would have posted online, what they would have said in a heated family argument. Right. And it just showed me how we've been conditioned, how we've gotten so used to speaking about politics in a certain way that we can't even express themselves in a way without demeaning the other side or putting the other side down. So it was fascinating to watch that. People were able to do it, but it took a lot of effort. And there was one session of the workshop in particular where people, the Reds, the Conservatives, and the Blues, the Liberals broke apart, and they had to spend a little bit of time coming up with questions for the other side, to things that they wanted to learn. It was ask one another. Right. But it couldn't be in an accusatory way. It couldn't be a loaded gotcha question. And I watched folks go through that process, and the moderators, the guides, had to get them to start over and over again, because again, so much in our daily life, we're bombarded with cable news and comments on Twitter and social media and websites that sort of play into all of our confirmation bias that we all have, that we've forgotten how to engage with one another in a respectful way. That doesn't presume that the other person's an idiot or our enemy. And so that was just fascinating to watch how hard it was for people. And to me, it illustrated how much work has to be done.
Yeah. And I think
it was.
I was just going to say, I think that's a key point about conditioning. And obviously, Better Angels is a process. There's no magic wand where you come to a workshop and suddenly you're, a better angel. It's an entree into a larger process that you undertake, both with your community, but also within yourself. And so one other question, and John, I want to give you a chance to weigh in too, but you mentioned the polarization in the United States has obviously been a long-running trend. It's been turbocharged, if you will, in the last 2 years. But I just wonder, from your perspective, being in the White House for the full 8 years, how did you watch our politics evolve or perhaps devolve? Because to my mind, Barack Obama came to power on a very inspiring message of bringing the country together. He wasn't shy about advocating for his progressive agenda, but I think he always made an effort to try to reach out to the other side and in his rhetoric adopt the Lincoln-esque rhetoric, if you will, of looking for our better angels. And I'm sure he's actually used that term multiple times. And yet at the same time, he presided over this shift toward increasing partisanship. So I'd just be curious, being on the inside, as you guys sort of watched the political environment become so toxic around you, what was that like? And Was it surprising to you guys? Was it disappointing? And why do you think it happened so intensely?
It's a lot there.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna try to answer this question without completely betraying my political perspective here, but that's a hard thing to do. I mean, I think, if you go back and look at his 2004 speech to the Democratic Convention in Boston, where, he launched himself in the national scene. And that was one of the reasons that speech resonated with so many people around the country, including so many Republicans. There was a time when there were Republicans for Obama. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
That was a message of unity. That was a message of, not a liberal America, conservative America, it's the United States of America. We are one people. That was a core message of unity. And, those themes were, I believe, consistent throughout his presidency. And then you go and you look at his farewell speech in Chicago that he gave in January. These themes are all still there. And in fact, there's a section of the speech which he doesn't use the phrase "better angel," but it's everything that you guys talk about. Right. It's about, he quotes Atticus Finch about, you never really understand this person until you climb into their skin and walk into their shoes. He challenges, blacks and other minorities to try to understand the plight of, the middle-aged white man who's seeing his world upended. He says we all have to try harder. He condemns the rise of naked partisanship. We can't keep talking to each other. So it's all there. And I do think these were the, my favorite, if you're arguing with strangers on the internet, try to talk with one in real life. I mean, he's basically making the better angels case, right? Getting out of our information bubbles, reading a news source that doesn't just feed all your preconceived notions. So those themes were there all along. And, having, as you said, I, got this chance to travel with the president. This is one of our greatest strengths as a country, to see how people in other countries react to that same message. And it's incredibly powerful. It's one of our greatest assets as a country, one of our foreign policy strengths. So, I'm answering this question as someone who worked for President Obama for nearly the whole 8 years. And, again, those themes are all there. One of your questions is why? Why did the polarization occur? You probably have a whole episode on that. But there was a poll in the last year of his presidency that's always stuck with me. 2006, 8 years into the president's term, he's wrapping up 8 years in office. And 8 years in office, 72% of Republicans still said they had doubts about where Barack Obama was born.
Right.
And that to me is a remarkable statistic. And that to me says that despite everything he did, despite everything he said, and again, he wasn't perfect. No leader is. He said some things that I'm sure he would not repeat or he would regret. The fact that so many people just question his basic legitimacy to be president. Again, I feel there were some real deep-seated issues that a lot of Americans had with Barack Obama that went beyond politics, that went beyond public policy issues, that went beyond any particular issue, to the question of who he was and whether or not he was a legitimate president, whether he was a legitimate American. And that foster, that's Sarah Palin, that's Donald Trump and birtherism, that's Tea Party, that's it's there. And I think I just don't think you can separate that out when 72% of the other party doesn't even believe that maybe you were born in the country. There's something bigger going on than just disputes over tax policy or education reform. There's something fundamental. And I think just a lot of people didn't accept the fact that he was who he was and that he was the legitimate president of the United States.
Well, Terry, you're clearly, first of all, let me say you're clearly a wordsmith, because listening to your description of the Better Angels workshop and the tightening that people feel when it comes time for them to sort of speak directly to each other across party lines about issues that they feel very strongly about, and yet they are committed to a process whereby they're being asked to communicate in a way that doesn't lend a pejorative flavor. or an accusatory nuance to their framing of questions and statements. It's definitely something that that we wrestle with, and it's a constructive tension, but a palpable one in the Better Angels experience. And of course, people do tend to emerge from that for the better. They tend to be stronger communicators and more empathetic listeners coming through it. But it is a process for many folks, and I'm very glad that you got to see that up close. Of course, you saw so many amazing things up close in your experience. I sort of get the sense that a presidential speechwriter, a person like yourself, is probably in some way kind of the keeper of the idealism, in some sense, of a presidential administration, or a person whose job has to do with preserving that idealism, because there was so many powerful themes of transcendence and unity. You mentioned the 2004 Democratic keynote speech that Barack Obama gave. But upon becoming president, any candidate has to go through that transition from campaigning in poetry to governing in prose. And, without seeking to make excuses for or defend, the behavior of congressional Republicans or, some other folks on the right, once it came down to the nitty-gritty business of not simply articulating the fact that, there's not a red America or a blue America, but there's a United States of America. Once it went from that to but we have to get the Affordable Care Act passed, and if we have to engage in some sort of some parliamentary sorts of activities to make sure we can get it through against the opposition of the GOP. Just the rough and tumble of party politics was always to some degree going to ensure the fact that the honeymoon was going to end. It always ends. And in our case, with the advent of social media during that time and the unique factor of having our first African-American president and a person with a very unique background, a man with an Islamic name and who was little known prior to that. You're right. We could spend much more than this episode kind of deconstructing all of the reasons why partisanship, which was already intensifying and had been intensifying, I think, under Clinton and under Bush, sort of accelerated under Obama, and now we are where we are. But I want to ask you something, though, about how self-aware you and the Obama team were of the sort of ongoing story or narrative that was being told and that had been told by then candidate Obama and then subsequently President Obama. This narrative that I thought was amazingly admirable and inspiring, in that it sought to lend an articulation to the idea that there really is a set of values that unite left and right in America, because there is a set of experiences that highlight the value of those convictions that can be traced through the arc of American history. So in the Better Angels workshops, we have people sort of struggling to communicate past their own ideological worldviews to see the common values that we have as Americans. And in the course of that process, we find ourselves in Better Angels sort of generating a new kind of American story, something that basically tells an old American story of shared values and shared heritage that maybe we've forgotten. And I guess you might not know this, Terry, but I worked for President Obama's campaign in 2008, and I was a Democrat at the time. But looking back on it, I still look back on it with tremendous fondness, because I saw when Barack Obama, for instance, gave his speech on race in the aftermath of the Jeremiah Wright controversy during the campaign, I saw him tell a story about American values that seemed to sort of wed a conviction that America truly is. Obama, very seldom used the words American exceptionalism, which folks on the right seem to want him to use. But Obama really did seem to tell the story about the exceptionalism of American ideals and sort of upholding the essential basis for our having a committed patriotism. But he would wed that to a process through activism and through the collective efforts of people to make of this country a more equitable society. He would tie the true exceptionalism of American ideals to the ongoing process of making this a more perfect union. And I think one line I can recall from that speech was that this work of making of activism and seeking greater justice and equality in the context of racial issues and so forth. It was the work of realizing the power of or the promise of their ideals in the context of the reality of our time, something to that effect. And I'm wondering if that was kind of a theme for the Obama White House and for the Obama speechwriters, this idea that we were actively trying to tell a story of a country whose, in contrast to what maybe some folks on the harder left might think, that we were a country that truly was founded on an exceptional bedrock of moral idealism. And then in contrast to what some hardliners on the right might think, that we perfect our national character and coming closer and closer towards the realization of those ideals through the process of agitating for a more equitable sort of society. Was that a self-conscious sort of storyline that President Obama and the team sort of sought to develop over time, or is that just something that kind of grew organically from Obama's own disposition and that wound up being a theme that simply, just as a matter of course, was evidenced in so much of President Obama's rhetoric and oratory?
Quite a question.
Yeah. To weave a few things in there. Yeah.
So, if the question is, did we do this consciously? Of course. I mean, this is what drew so many of us, including yourself, to Barack Obama in the first place. The fact that his own life experience was a reflection of the larger American experience. And when he became president and became a spokesperson and ambassador for our country, around the world, this was absolutely something that I think if you go, I would challenge you to find a speech where it's not in there somewhere. I think it goes to the core of who he is as a person. It goes to the core of who he was as president and to the actual story of our country. I mean, I think everybody, if the basic idea that, we were founded on certain ideals, with a commitment to certain ideals, but we were, like every nation, an imperfect nation, and have spent the past 200 something years trying to live up to those ideals and perfect our union. I would have to think there's folks all across the political spectrum who agree, of course we can always do better. If we were all satisfied with where we were, whether it's economic justice or racial justice, any kind of injustice, then we could just stop. There's no point for politics. We can just, we could just hand over the government to some computers and run the government algorithms and allocate the money, to various government programs. But the point is, we all agree that there's more work to do, and that when there are, people forget, the right to marriage, freedom to marriage, it only came about in the last few years. I mean, so this is, so every, whether it's gender equality or racial inequalities, there's always more to do. And so this was something that was, again, integral to who he was as a person, therefore integral to who he was as a president and to the policies. It was always something. And again, I go back to, because I had the opportunity to watch him communicate these values and this American story to people around the world, especially young people. Whenever we would travel, we would always try to have these big town halls with young people in Africa and South America, Asia, wherever, everywhere. And to see him get up and to stand there and tell them that, he was born at a time when many states had laws against that made it illegal for his father and mother to even be married in the first place. And then here he stands as president of the United States. It's an incredibly powerful message to people all around the world. There is no country in the world that doesn't struggle with issues of economic inequality, racial inequality, ethnic inequalities. And the fact that, he could get up and talk about our journey. And I would say, he often got accused by folks on the right, usually folks who didn't even read the speech, for apologizing to America, for America overseas. And I can tell you, having, again, been in the room for a lot of those speeches, it just didn't happen. And what he was doing was he was sharing our experience, sharing that story, that journey that you talked about. Because what it does, it would do a number of things. And one of the things it would do, it would send a powerful signal to these young people, people of all ages, but especially young people. Man, if Barack Obama, the president of the United States, can get up and acknowledge that the country isn't perfect, then why can't my leader get up and acknowledge that in one way it was very subversive. He did it with a smile. He kept it positive. He wasn't pointing a finger at the ruling regime of the country he was in. But everybody in those rooms knew exactly what he was doing. He was talking like, there's an ethnic minority in Indonesia or Burma that is not being treated justly. They could look and listen to his story about how Americans of African American descent secured greater equality and greater civil rights through peaceful protest. It's a powerful, powerful message that he could deliver. So yeah, that story was and again, I would challenge you to find a speech where it wasn't there, because again, it was so central to who he is as a person and what his presidency represented.
Yeah. Well, I too loved watching President Obama abroad. I worked on the re-election campaign in 2012, which was a very formative experience for me. I was 21 at the time and was super inspiring. And just a quick anecdote, I remember maybe in the last month of President Obama's term, I just randomly tuned into a Facebook Live that the White House page was doing, and I think he was in some Southeast Asian country, and he had just given a speech that was very powerful and touched on a lot of the themes you mentioned, and then he was taking questions from an audience of young people, and then just seeing President Obama in his natural state talking to young people and the way he lights up. And I think one of the students said, "Oh, I'm a rapper. Can I spit a couple bars?" And then, President Obama kind of went back and forth, and just the genuine, the cool factor that people talk about, but just also the sort of genuine love and respect that he had for people across difference, across age, I think was something that really came through to young Americans across the political spectrum in some ways. And so one question that comes to mind, just hearing you talk about these various speeches abroad, of all the speeches that you wrote or worked on, which one are you most proud of and why?
There's again, you get to write a lot of them, and a lot of them mean different things to you. The one that I always come back to, and again, I grew up in Massachusetts. I lived in Boston for the first few years of my life, a lot of family and friends there. And so after the bombing of the Boston Marathon, the president went up and spoke at the memorial service, and I was able to be a part of that and help work on that and help draft that. And that to me is one that, again, just on a very personal level, means a great deal to me. And one of the things that I value about that speech is, again, if you remember, the bombing occurred on a Monday. I think he gave he spoke at the service on a Thursday, and at that time there was debate about whether or not he should even go. The manhunt was still underway. We didn't know who the perpetrators were. So at the time, but we knew that if it turned out that they were doing this in any way with any kind of sort of political overtones or anything involving our foreign policy, that there was probably going to be tremendous blowback against certain minority communities in the Boston area. And so a key part of that speech, and actually one of the themes of the entire speech, if you go back and read it, is about how this is a town that, whether it's the universities or immigrants, that this is a community that even has welcomed people from all over the world for many, many years, as a kind of preempting what we were worried about what would come. And so I'm particularly, proud of having been a part of that one. Mm-hmm. But again, there's some, every region of the world, we had a chance to speak to folks, and there are speeches that a lot of folks overseas can recite line by line that most Americans have never heard of, but we got to be a part of all of those.
Yeah. Or, I think one of the really salient tragedies of the way in which we tend to relate to elected officials and leaders and people on the other side of the aisle, perhaps as a result of the media-driven polarization, which you've mentioned, is in this tendency people have to sort of look at their political opponents and especially the leaders of the other party and to think that if they can imagine what that person's sort of lowest possible motive might be for doing a certain thing, they found the only possible motive for why it is they've done or said a certain thing. And so it's a shame in my mind that you've given testimony to these powerful themes and ideas and stories that were articulated across the course of the Obama administration. And yet, I think that for many people, and certainly many people on the right, the things that stand out are, statements like they cling to their guns and mm-hmm. religion as a way of, seemingly communicating the perception of the bigotry and ignorance of middle America. And so forth, or maybe an arguably the cops acted stupidly with respect to Henry Louis Gates' situation, where black scholar Henry Louis Gates was arrested by a police officer at his home, who initially it seemed like a sheerly racially motivated incident, and later on it seemed clear that there was a bit more nuance to what actually took place.
Right.
Like you said, every leader is imperfect, and I think that we could make very similar observations about George W. Bush and the Bush administration, And
I was just going to say, yeah. I totally agree with you. Listen, I think I'm glad you brought that up because, I think every single politician at one time or another has said things that they regret. Mm-hmm. A great test of whether they stand by their remarks is whether they stand by their remarks, whether they say it again. Mm-hmm. And when they don't, that they realize that they've said something inartfully. And yeah, absolutely. You ask a lot of folks in certain parts of the country, and they feel that a lot of Democrats and liberals speak down to them and condescend to them. Whether it's clinging to your religion or your guns or deplorables. I think that the what we all have to be mindful of too, and I think is to not fall into the trap of saying, oh well, both sides do it, and therefore both sides are equally to blame. I think having discussions like this is really important. It's one thing when someone like Barack Obama says something that is both inartful and that many Americans found offensive. People of faith, people who own guns, found that those remarks deeply offensive, and he did not repeat them. I think there's a fundamental difference with someone like a Donald Trump, who every day seems to go out of his way to stoke some of the most raw racial, class, cultural, ethnic divisions in our country, as a matter of strategy, as a matter of a deliberate strategy to hold together that 30 to 40% that he still has. Zero effort made to truly unify the country. And so I think you're absolutely right. We always have to, when any politician says something that doesn't bring people together, that puts down, puts down someone else. But I do think we are living in the last few years through a particularly dangerous time. And this is something truly unique in our country's history that I think makes the job of better angels all the more difficult, because we could be having this discussion in 2014 or 2007, but wouldn't have Donald Trump's demonization layered on top of it. the way we do now.
Yeah.
So again, it makes it hard. It makes it hard, and it makes it hard for, this poses we look around the world and how extremism often begets extremism.
Yeah.
And it becomes a cycle of radicalization. It is really hard, and you're seeing this now in the Democratic Party. It is really hard when you have someone like Donald Trump up there every day, sort of speaking to the people's worst impulses, to be restrained, to be moderate, to be, reasonable in the face of such demagoguery. It's really hard. And it's dangerous for our country, and it makes it really hard and again, I saw it in your workshop, how hard it is for people to have civil discussions when we're dealing with something truly extraordinary at the highest levels.
Yeah. Well, I just, I wasn't there in person. I was speaking from a remote location, but I just spoke to CPAC recently. As a matter of fact, I was on a panel that followed immediately after President Trump was finished, which was kind of surreal because he was scheduled for 30 or 40 minutes, and I don't think he had.
Act to follow.
I don't think Terry Szuplat wrote that speech. I
don't think anybody wrote that speech.
I don't think anybody wrote that speech.
From
that was
the depths of the president's mind.
Well, he's quite a performer, man. I got to tell you, and he really, he and President Obama have very different types of charisma, but they both certainly have, say what you will about anything else. They both certainly have charisma, and Trump has his own brand. And so, I watched what was originally supposed to be a 40-minute speech from the president turn into a 2-hour speech. And then I sat there sort of thinking to myself, Jesus, after all of that is said and done, the very next face these folks are going to be seeing is mine. Like, how exactly am I going to follow that, But the reason I mention it is simply because I think that most of President Trump supporters, and when you're, at CPAC or in at a Trump rally, or just in a room with, I'm in a room with other Republicans and other conservatives. I mean, usually, Trump's support in the Republican Party is very high. He has very committed opponents within the party and on very high levels, but they represent a distinct minority within the party. I don't think that most of Trump's supporters really look at him as trying to unite the country. I think they think that he would like to, if the left were willing to play ball. But I think
to submit.
But I don't think that's necessarily the internal language going. Well,
on. There's a great. All your listeners should go online. I would never encourage this normally, but Steve Bannon made a movie a year or so ago, and it's called Trumpet War.
Right.
And you don't have to watch the whole movie; you just have to watch the trailer. And what it is, it's scenes of peaceful red hat wearing Trump supporters being assaulted by far left, Antifa folks, and it's just scene after scene after scene.
Yeah.
And it culminates with Trump saying, "We are at war."
Right.
And I think more than anything, that really captures how a lot of his core, diehard supporters see this.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
And they don't. There, as you say, they did not elect him to reach out to the left. They did not elect him to unify the country. They elected him to blow up the system.
Yeah.
And to expel Muslims, as he promised to do during the campaign, and to build a wall to keep out Mexicans. I mean, this was not a candidate who ran on a promise and a pledge to unify the country, and that's not why people voted for him. And so, therefore, that's not why he's governing.
Well,
I think that this is deliberate, and he's delivering. I'll give him this. He's doing what he said. It's all there. He hasn't wavered.
Yeah, I mean, in a host of areas, I think that Donald Trump was elected to fight back against forces that were perceived as maybe existential threats, either to the material well-being or to the very character of the country. Whether you're talking about a corrupt political establishment or illegal immigration, national security threats, and obviously I would say it's obvious that the rhetoric of President Trump's campaign tilted rather decisively into towards inflaming racial and cultural conflicts in this country. There's no question about it in my mind. But I think that part of what set the stage for such a candidacy, whether you supported Trump or not, is this idea that is so prevalent on both sides that the other side is the enemy, and on the right in particular that, you know, the progressive universe that Barack Obama represented was one that was, you know, self-consciously hostile to the identity and to the interests, you know, perhaps of the country, but certainly of conservative America. And I'm wondering if, from your experience, you might be able to tell a different story about the relationships and the interactions that you may have seen or that you may be aware of the president having with conservatives, with Republicans, whether on the level of leadership or on the level of interacting with just the American people, with conservatives and Republican voters across the country. Naturally, you know, the president's attitude towards the right is going to be defined pejoratively through, you know, partisan media on the right, and it's just the way George W. Bush would have been defined in a corresponding way in partisan media on the left. But were you able to see and you know, we've seen Republican politicians criticize President Obama publicly, who we have reason to suspect might get along with him better privately. Are you able to sort of share a different side of those relationships? Was there common ground and good faith that you observed between the president and conservatives? Is there connections there?
Sure.
That we
well,
can
you know, I think
to?
there's a great example of this, which is the endless discussions and work that he did with John Boehner when John Boehner was leading the House Republicans, especially through all of the negotiations over shutdowns and debt ceilings and what have you. And over again, and listen, there's, you know, you couldn't find two people who are politically more different in terms of either their politics or their life story than Barack Obama and John Boehner. And yet they were able to sit down and time and again get to a point where there seemed to be some sort of an agreement on the way forward. And Boehner would, I mean, my understanding from both what I observed at the White House and everything that I've read, which is what you've read, which is that, you know, Boehner would leave and there was the outlines of an agreement. There was a way forward. But when he went back to the House, there's just a chunk of Republicans in that chamber who were not interested in compromising with Barack Obama. And he time and again could not deliver on what he had indicated to President Obama was possible. And you know, again, Paul Ryan encountered the same thing, where you have this, you know, Tea Party / Freedom Caucus that is just, again, they're not sort of going back. They're of the same kind of you know, cloth as Trump. They weren't elected to compromise. They weren't elected to find consensus. They were elected to, you know, to advance a certain agenda and ideology, and that's what they're going to do. And sitting down and negotiating and finding common ground with Barack Obama was not their goal, and it was just not going to happen. And again, this goes back to those sort of larger forces that we were talking about at the beginning. Right. When you have decades upon decades of gerrymandering, right, that have led to fewer and fewer moderates and centrists in either house, and the death of the center, first in the Republican Party in the House in the 1990s under Newt Gingrich, and more recently on both sides, the center is just disappearing. The number of House members and members of the Senate who can reach across, they don't exist anymore. And so how do you govern? How do you find consensus? How do you find compromise when especially on the House side, gerrymandered districts create zero incentive for anyone to compromise? I mean, they're more worried. Most members of Congress are more worried about getting primaried from the far left or the far right than they are losing in the general election because their district is otherwise safe. How do you forge consensus and compromise in that environment? And so there's big forces, big historical, political, economic, social, cultural forces at work here that have, again, made it harder and harder and harder for our leaders in Washington to find that middle ground that you guys, it's easy for folks sitting in a workshop in the church basement in Arlington, Virginia on a Saturday to acknowledge that each other's right. Well, they're not accountable to constituencies that have elected them to advance a certain agenda. So
Right.
it's much harder for the leaders to do this.
Yeah, I think that certainly squares with my own political analysis, the Freedom Caucus's ability to prevent Boehner and Ryan from even bringing pieces of compromised legislation to the floor because they couldn't command a majority within the Republican caucus. But I think as we look forward, which I think is something that President Obama always tried to do, even from the beginning of his administration where, he's getting pressure from the left to try to investigate members of the Bush administration. And he said, well, we don't want to relitigate and recriminate. We want to look forward. And you mentioned President Obama's work now, obviously, is focused, I think, pretty significantly on gerrymandering, is trying to engage these institutional and structural forces that are perpetuating polarization, as well as taking direct action through his foundations to try to improve our civic culture and speak to young people. But looking forward, again, putting on your political hat, how do you think Democrats can and should message to the nation in their rhetoric? Because obviously it's very challenging, as you mentioned, to square one's, frankly, disgust at President Trump and conviction that we really need to stand up against bigotry and oppression in this time of historic upheaval, with the need to be empathetic, to be compassionate, and to embrace what Barack Obama was able to so admirably do time and time again in the face of such recalcitrant obstruction. How can Democrats do that? Because to me, it's both the moral thing to do, and I think it's actually probably tactically, ultimately, the right thing to do if they want to expand their coalition. How can they do that in the face of the pressure that's going to be exerted upon them by the base to go to the far left and to oppose Trump at every turn? So I'm just curious how you think they can do that, and what do you think is going to happen in the next 16 months, Terry?
Right. So listen, right, this is one of the great debates within the Democratic Party right now. Go far left or go with particularly a candidate who's going to represent, and advocate for the progressive base, or someone with a more centrist bent. I mean, let's have it both ways here and say, I don't think you should go either or. I mean, you need, in my mind, your ideal candidate, your ideal approach is going to do two things. It's going to both, of course, energize and mobilize your progressive base, but you're going to do it in a way that doesn't turn off independents and turn off those Obama-Trump voters that people are always forgetting about. It's hard to imagine today, but there was something like 700 counties that Obama won twice, and Trump flipped about a third of them.
Right.
By some estimates, there are about 10% of Obama voters turned around and voted for Trump. Now, on one level, that seems absurd. Then again, if you think that those folks were voting for someone to blow up the system because they can't stand what's going on with Washington, they see an economy and a political system that's broken, it makes sense that someone could cast a vote for both of those men. So to me, I think it comes down to tone. I think it comes down to approach. I think it's going to be a candidate that, again, that can represent progressive causes, but do it in a way that doesn't antagonize and alienate people socially, culturally, politically. And so, I mean, just my own personal view is, this whole issue, I can't believe we're having a debate about whether or not Michelle Obama was right on whether when they go low, we go high.
Totally.
I think history has shown that when you go low, first of all, you will never go as low as Donald Trump.
Right.
You were never going to match him. You're never going to beat him. You're never going to, you're never going to go lower than he's going to go. So you will never win that particular fight. And we've seen, so whether it was Nixon in 68, or, Ted Cruz being chased out of a restaurant, or, Antifa protesters showing up at Tucker Carlson's house, these things backfire.
Totally.
It plays into people's fears. It allows the other side. So I think, to your point, I think politically, why would we ever give up on those Obama Trump voters? Why would we not do everything in our power to earn them back. Hillary Clinton only lost by 78,000 votes across Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If she had just won 78,000 votes across those three states, she would be president. So on one level, the challenge for the next nominee is to win those 78,000 votes back. But I say, why stop there? Don't you want a candidate with the broadest possible appeal? And so to me, just personally, again, I'm looking for a candidate. I'm looking for someone who can give those Obama-Trump voters a reason to come back.
I completely agree. Well, that leads me to ask, what do you think about Pete Buttigieg? He's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He's obviously very young. I think he's 37. And
he's too old for the job.
He's too old for the job, and obviously has a very interesting story as somebody who grew up in, a traditionally red state. Obviously, Indiana went for Obama in 2008. And then went for Trump by, 15 points in 2016. So it sort of, emblemizes exactly what you were talking about. And I think just personally, of all the candidates I've heard, and obviously he's going to be a long shot, he's done a very impressive job of being able to thread that needle. So I'd be curious what you think of him, and if there are any other specific candidates that you think can sort of match the challenge that you just articulated.
Yeah, so I think anybody who is at least trying to both, energize the base, but do it in a way that's respectful and that respects people, independence, respects those Obama, Trump voters, and tries to, I'm going to be looking hard at all of those things. So Mayor Pete is definitely someone who does that. Beto O'Rourke is someone who gives voice to that. Cory Booker is someone who's giving voice to that approach. It sounds like, if Joe Biden runs, that's going to be a centerpiece of his campaign. So again, there are any number of candidates who recognize that. And, I think, to the Democrats' credit, they're going to have a lot of choices. And if we play it right, we're hopefully going to avoid the dangers of the circular firing squad.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting. Well, it looks like we're coming up to the top of the hour, but I think we can probably go a few minutes extra. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, well, one other question from me, and might be a hard question, Terry. I don't know. But obviously you are, opposed to Donald Trump and would probably like to see a Republican Party that, maybe moves away from Trump and Trump-era politics. But putting that big piece aside for the moment, what is it that you might like to see as an American and as a person who wants for us to have a political discourse and culture that highlights our common values in the ways that you've spoken to? What is it that you'd like to see from the conservative movement as we move forward in time? Mm-hmm. I know that there are people that you respect and admire on the right side of the aisle. And I've heard Barack Obama say that, there needs to be both a healthy Democratic Party and a healthy Republican Party, right? That one country does not, define politics for everybody indefinitely.
It's dangerous for a country when you have a dysfunctional system and when one party, is having a crack up like this. Mm. I mean, there's every day, like Michael Gerson, a speechwriter for President Bush, George W. Bush, writes about this all the time. Mm. He is just in despair about what has happened to the party that he believed in and that he committed so much of his life to in serving in the White House. He's in despair about what's happened to his party and how it was hijacked by this guy who clearly does not embrace. So I want, as an American, I want a healthy political system. I want functioning political parties. I want there to be a choice so that there's not just one party that's associated with diversity, right? Ethnic and religious and gender diversity. I want there to be, more than one party that welcomes immigrants. I mean, you go back and we've all seen these clips from the 1980s with Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush saying things about immigrants they would never win they could never win the Republican nomination today. They're somewhere like Democrats. So I think that's dangerous when only one party, and ultimately it's bad for everybody. It's bad for Democrats. It's bad for the country when one party is so beholden to a small subset of voters. I mean, that's just not healthy for any democracy. And so you see people like Michael Gerson and people like the former governor of Ohio, Kasich, and Larry Hogan of Maryland, and all of these, quote unquote, never Trumpers who made a conscious choice not to be part of this administration because they didn't want to, look their children and grandchildren in the eye and have to answer for the fact that they enabled this man. There are a lot of Republicans out there who want their party to go in a different direction. They don't have the numbers right now, and who knows what it will take. It could take years. It's taken years. It's taken years, there was a time when kind of Democrats kind of went off the rails for a while. It took years to kind of get back to a place where they could win a national election again.
Yeah, I think that point is well taken. And obviously when you contrast, the Hogans and the Kasichs with the vast majority of Republicans who, have gone from, take Lindsey Graham, for example, gone from fiercely opposing Trump to, complimenting him at every turn, one can get cynical. But then when you come down to the people and ordinary folks, and, I've seen it in workshops, keeping in mind that it's challenging and it's never going to happen overnight, I think you see real potential for a transcendence, the kind of transcendence that Barack Obama always gave voice to. You can see that happening among ordinary people when you bring them together and you do it with a structure that's designed to help people see past without surrendering their differences to try to recognize this common humanity that calls upon the higher ideals of the nation and the pursuit, however imperfect our country may be, of a more perfect union. So, and
I think that's what made a figure like Ronald Reagan so inspiring, a person who I think that Barack Obama also had a great deal of respect for and much commented on. Reagan brought with him a politics of optimism. It's not to say that Ronald Reagan was not strident and philosophically committed. Obviously, he was. But I think that the idea of mourning in America and sort of looking at the at the recapturing of spirit of American optimism in a way to where, as Reagan said, we can look at the path of progress as being one in which there is no left or right, but there is only up or down. I think that there was an attempt to kind of frame things in a manner that was accessible to Americans across the political spectrum. And for myself, that's what I hope to see from all of our elected officials. I think that our subjective philosophies are what they are going to be, but I think that the human experiment of democratic republic society, is one in which we've got to find a way to express our subjective values in ways that make them relevant and accessible to everybody as much as we can. And you'll never do it perfectly, I imagine, but that should nevertheless be our goal, So that's what I'm hoping.
This was one of the most inspiring moments from the workshop that I attended at the very end, when everyone's asked to go around the room and say what they learned and specifically what they would do differently in their lives. And I remember there's this older man, a conservative, who said, I think I'm going to start reading the New York Times a little bit more. And there was this younger woman, a liberal, and she said, I think I'm going to try to be a little bit more humble when I'm engaged in my political discussions. I don't have all the answers. And, so there are things that, everybody, the whole country, citizens, we all got ourselves here. One of the things that actually I take a lot of hope from is that, according to some of these polls, 84% of Americans agree that we are bitterly divided on deeply important kind of issues and values. I don't know who those other 16% are that think we're not bitterly divided. But no one, and Republicans, when they go around these workshops, no one likes how they're perceived by the other side. No one likes being stereotyped. No one wants to be this divided. And, it's like a small segment of the political class, the pundits who are kind of driving this discourse every day. And
profiting
it would
from
be great if we could get tremendous profits. People are getting rich off of dividing the country, and if we could get 300 million Americans into a Better Angels workshop, it'd probably be a great place to start.
Well, that is certainly the goal. And before we round out, I want to tell you, Terry, a little bit and our listeners about our convention. But before that, you mentioned the guy who said he's going to start giving the New York Times another chance. I know I traditionally pretty much just read the New York Times, supplemented by other mainstream media. With John's encouragement, I've started reading the National Review a little bit. I still disagree with it most of the time, but it really enriches my own perspective and ability to articulate my own position. And I've even started writing op-eds in Fox News, which I never thought I'd be doing. And I've gotten some heat from my friends on the left saying, how could you be in Fox News? But it's really like, how could we not be in Fox News if we're trying to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish? So before we go, I just wanted to give a quick plug for our next big event, which really crystallizes what is the future of Better Angels. It is the second annual Better Angels National Convention. It's going to be held at Washington University in St. Louis from June 20th to June 23rd. We are going to be bringing together hundreds of liberal and conservative delegates of all ages, of all backgrounds, from across the country to, at a most basic level, form relationships, but also to build our movement as we grow into 2020. So, Terry, I know you live in D.C. I'd love to extend a formal invite if you want to stop by. Otherwise, maybe, patch in from Zoom or whatever. But we are really excited about this, and we think this is sort of the next step as we seek to scale this work. Because, as you mentioned, we've seen it be effective, at least insofar as it's gotten people to step back a little bit and say, well, wait a minute, let me think about how I communicate. Let me think about how I see the other side as a human being and not just a demon that I want to dunk on Twitter. Mm-hmm. How can we take that and how can we scale our movement, not so necessarily that 300 million people participate in a workshop, but so that millions of people are touched by our message in a meaningful way. So that's what we're thinking about. That's what we're focused on. And that's what we're hoping to do at the convention. So if there's anyone out there that is interested by this, please go to our website, become a Better Angels member, and apply to be a delegate at the convention. And then last thing, just because we got 5 minutes more, I think, if we want it. Terry, do you have any questions for me and John?
Well, you sort of got to it. If you're writing stuff that appears in the Fox News website, that's one example. Are there other examples where, I wouldn't say whether your views have changed, but whether you find yourself doing things a little bit differently in your daily life that has allowed you to maybe understand each other better?
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the main reasons, among many others, that I admire John, because I think he's been doing this since he was born, or at least since he was in diapers. But, for me, I grew up in New York City. Both my parents are progressive. Vast majority of my friends were progressive. I worked in Democratic politics, which, has become increasingly solidified in some of its beliefs, although there's always going to be debate. And so I'd always considered myself someone who really valued diversity and saw myself as somebody who was diverse. I had friends who spanned the racial spectrum, socioeconomic spectrum, but I never really thought much about political diversity. I had a couple of friends who leaned more conservative philosophically, but I had never really thought about the fact that I was reflexively kind of otherizing people who lived in other parts of the country and people who had voted for George Bush and people who opposed Obama and even people who, insisted that Barack Obama was a Muslim. And then through Better Angels, I've started to work with philosophical conservatives and Trump supporters, and I've started to think about their backgrounds, think about why they believe what they believe, and even start to see the value, if not in their political positions, but their ideological perspective. And I think that has improved my ability to be an empathetic person, but it's actually improved and solidified my progressive values, because I think that's really how you start to think more intentionally and impactfully about the change you want to see, is by talking to people you disagree with, being able to draw upon the value of their beliefs in certain ways and incorporate that into your message so that it has broader resonance and can speak to people who come from different backgrounds and who have arrived at their positions through perfectly understandable and ultimately valid ways. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I've gained a lot of value from working with Better Angels. I've gained new friends, and I feel better about myself, and I feel better about the country. Although then if I log into Twitter, it can go down the drain pretty damn quickly.
Evaporates.
Well, I thought if you're going to ask, what are things? There's some things people can do right now, today, in the next hour, to kind of to help this entire situation, and that's stop watching cable news, stop sharing political items on Facebook, get off Twitter. I've never heard someone say, it's a great point. I learned something new on Twitter today.
Yeah. And start listening to the Better Angels podcast.
There you go.
There you go.
Terry, thank you so much, my friend. And I hope that we can keep in touch and work together as we move forward. Because, United States of America, I refuse to believe that our best days are not yet ahead of us, And talking to you and being a part of this movement gives me hope, too, every day.
So thanks for doing what you guys do. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Come back anytime.